Mr Nick Clegg.
Mr Speaker, a few days ago I got in touch with Charles because I was looking for a telephone number of someone that we both knew. His friends will not be surprised to learn that we were texting each other. He was notoriously bad at actually answering his phone, but famously fluent in SMS. He said he didn't have the number on him, but he would get back to me this week, because he was spending time with his beloved son, Donald, during his half-term break. While we all remember Charles as a formidable parliamentarian and a much-loved politician, it is worth remembering that he retained his greatest pride and devotion for his family. He lived next door to his parents and latterly his brother in his grandfather's Croft House near Fort William, and cared for them through sickness and old age. Much though he was wedded to politics all his life, I think Charles would have wanted to be remembered as a kind and loving father, brother and son first, and an accomplished politician second. And my thoughts and condolences are with all his families, especially Donald and friends today. Maybe, Mr Speaker, it was that enduring humanity. People always came before politics for Charles, which is reflected in the heartfelt tributes over the last 24 hours from so many outside the world of politics who didn't know him directly, but somehow still felt that they did know him and could relate to him. He had, and still has, that rare gift for someone in public life that when people think of him, they smile. He saw good in people, even his staunchest political foes, and that always brought out the best in people in return. He was the polar opposite, Mr Speaker, of a cardboard cutout, point-scoring party politician. Brave, yet vulnerable. Brilliant, yet flawed. As he would often say about people he admired most, he was a fully signed-up member of the human race. And, Mr Speaker, he was funny. He was very funny. But his good humour must not obscure the fact that there was a steely courage about him, most memorably on display when he took the principal decision to oppose the Iraq War. Just because that might seem an obvious thing to have done now, it most certainly wasn't at the time. Charles was often a lone voice in this House, standing up against a consensus in favour of war on all sides. And the fact that he was proved so spectacularly right is a tribute to his judgment and his intuitive common sense. Mr Speaker, I think Charles would be the first to admit cheerily that he was not exactly a details man when it came to policy. He treated the necessary but often tedious detail of policy discussions within the Liberal Democrats with the same attitude he viewed Ben Nevis in his own constituency, something to be admired from afar, but a trial to be endured by others. And one of his earliest decisions when he became leader of the Liberal Democrats was to end the long-held convention that the leader of the party should attend all of the regular and invariably lengthy meetings of the Liberal Democrat Federal Party Policy Committee. It was a characteristically wise decision for which I was forever grateful during my time as leader. But again, Mr Speaker, his disregard for the undergrowth of policy-making should not obscure his unusually instinctive and deadly serious appreciation of the bigger picture in politics, whether on Europe or constitutional reform or his arguments against nationalism and the politics of identity, or his lifelong belief in social justice. Charles had a gut instinct about the big challenges and the big choices we faced, not the daily twists and turns and sleights of hand that dominate so much of Westminster politics. He understood, above all, I believe, that politics is at its best when it speaks to people's values in their hearts, not just the dry policy debates of the head. Mr Speaker, there is so much that I will miss about Charles: his wit, his warmth, his modesty. But I suspect many of us will feel his absence most keenly when our country decides in the next year or two whether we belong or not in the European Union. Because of all his convictions, his internationalism endured most strongly. He was a proud Highlander, a proud Scot, a man who believed in our community of nations within the United Kingdom, but also a lifelong believer that our outward-facing character as a country is best secured by remaining at the heart of Europe rather than retreating elsewhere. And as the debate becomes dominated, as it no doubt will, by the noise of statistical claim and counterclaim, I will miss the lyrical clarity of Charles's belief that our future as an open-hearted and generous-spirited country is at stake and must be defended at all costs. Mr. Speaker, a couple of years ago, Charles and I found ourselves cowering under the shelter of a parasol on the terrace of the National Liberal Club in the pouring rain for what he called a wee bit of fresh air, a wonderfully inappropriate euphemism for a quick smoke. We talked at length about the difficulties that the Liberal Democrats were facing within the then coalition government. It is a measure of the man that even though he was almost alone in our party in not supporting the decision to enter into coalition in May 2010, there was never a hint of reproach or I told you so in the advice he gave to me then and in other conversations. He remained unstintingly loyal, no matter what the circumstances, and no matter how strong the temptation must have been to blow his own trumpet and say that events had proved him right. He was far too subtle for that. He had made his views clear at the outset, but respected in good faith what his party colleagues were seeking to achieve in government and provided support and advice every step of the way. Which is why it was no surprise when he said, after being challenged about his loyalties after the 2010 election, as the Prime Minister has already cited, "I will go out of this world, feet first, with my Lib Dem membership card in my pocket. I am just devastated that it has happened so soon." Our Liberal political family has lost one of its most admired advocates. British politics has lost one of its best storytellers. This House has lost one of its warmest wits and most loyal parliamentarians. Mr. Speaker, if we could all carry ourselves with a little more of the honesty, wisdom and humility of Charles Kennedy, politics would be held in much higher esteem than it is today.
Mr. Kenneth Clarke.
Mr. Speaker, I am grateful for the opportunity to make a very brief addition to the tributes already paid by the party leaders, with which I wholly agree. I too am one of those who remember Charlie Kennedy first arriving in the House of Commons in 1983, when he made a very startling impression. He was very young. He was a student. He looked like a schoolboy. And rapidly people realised that in addition to all these rather striking attributes, he combined it with being highly intelligent, very articulate, very self-confident and capable of addressing this House in a very, very fluent and eloquent way, with that jokey, relaxed charm which was his very distinctive style, which I don't recall anybody quite actually achieving in the way that he did. He rapidly became, because he was such an unexpected but unique figure, very prominent not only in Parliament but nationally. And he looked as though he would have been destined for a brilliant national career, apart from the limited expectations of the Social Democrats and the Liberal Party with which he then associated himself. Well, he did actually achieve a good national career, and he eventually took his party to heights that would have been unimaginable electorally when he first arrived. And I do believe that his own distinct personality made a very great contribution to that. People have said that his great moment was the Iraq War, and I do agree with that. But he actually made many other strong, principled positions on Europe. He was wrong sometimes, as he was on the coalition, but he always had this candid sincerity with which he expressed his views, and he always came to clear and principled conclusions which he was prepared to argue for. We will all miss him. His personal attributes we all know, but they never made him unpleasant, if sometimes they made it a little difficult, and it made him a more rounded character. I'm glad to say that he was one of the last of that great tradition which said you should best address political problems in the atmosphere of a smoke-filled room, which has been lost today. But if I may, I will agree with the Right Honourable Lady. My main memories of Charles, apart from the pleasure of always being on good terms with him, but it does demonstrate that if you make a life in politics, you can actually meet some remarkably decent, honest, very highly principled people, and people like Charlie Kennedy will leave their mark on this House for many years to come. My sympathies also go out to his family and friends.
Yes. Sir Gerald Kaufman.
Mr. Speaker, I first met Charles Kennedy on his first day in the House of Commons when I went into the members' dining room and saw this young man looking forlorn and lost, wandering around and wondering what to do. I asked him to join me at lunch, and I found out who he was, and he was the youngest member of the House of Commons. But the fact that he was young, although it meant that he was not at that stage going to assert himself, did not mean that he didn't know why he was in the House of Commons. He was in the House of Commons to stand up for certain principles about which he felt strongly, and he stood for those principles in this House of Commons and outside this House of Commons from that first day right through to the end. He had very, very strong views, but he was never vindictive. He was never malevolent in expounding those views. He knew where he stood, he worked out where he should stand, and you knew that when Charles Kennedy spoke, he'd thought it out, he'd thought it through, and at the same time you would not budge him unless you could argue him out of a position, and his positions were pretty strong. It's been mentioned again and again, and rightly so, that he opposed the Iraq War, and it's been mentioned again that that was not an easy thing to do at the time, and was not the view of the overwhelming majority of the House of Commons at that time. But you would not budge Charles if he'd worked out a position and he believed that position to be right. He was always genial, he was always fun, it was good to be in his company. You rarely saw him without a smile on his face, but the smile on his face was not a smile of appeasement, it was a smile of geniality, and it was a smile of goodwill. I knew him over the years, and I always valued his company and his opinions. I join with the rest of the House in expressing my profound sympathy to his family. We shall miss him.
Yeah.